On the Southern Pacific Line, mountain engineers braced for every run through the Sierra tunnels, knowing that sometimes the trains would emerge, while their crews, overcome by toxic smoke, did not. For decades, the industry mocked the idea of a backwards locomotive, convinced no design could challenge nature and tradition at the same time. Yet what began as an engineering punchline quietly became a lifeline, breaking the rules, and ending a hidden wave of asphyxiation deaths no one else dared confront. But why did a design so radical, so life-saving, exist nowhere else? Before we can answer that, we have to face the darkness those crews endured. East of Sacramento, the Southern Pacific Main Line climbs into the Sierra Nevada, a route that forced railroading to its physical limits. The crossing over Donner Pass rises to nearly 7,000 feet above sea level. But it wasn't just altitude that threatened crews. The line's true danger lay in its endless series of enclosures. By the turn of the 20th century, trains faced a gauntlet of 39 tunnels, some stretching for thousands of feet, and nearly 40 miles of snow sheds, wooden structures built to shield the tracks from avalanches and blizzards. These were not isolated obstacles. On the eastbound ascent, a locomotive could disappear into a tunnel, emerge for a brief gasp of daylight, and plunge straight into miles of shed with only a few seconds of open air in between. In winter, snow sealed the landscape tight, and ventilation inside these enclosures was minimal. Smoke and exhaust had nowhere to go. The geography forced a relentless climb. Grades often reached 2.2%, enough to demand maximum power from every engine. Heavily loaded freights crawled uphill at walking speed, throttle wide open, boilers roaring. Each time a train entered a tunnel or snow shed, the exhaust from its own stack, and sometimes from double-headed or triple-headed locomotives, would billow back along the train. In these conditions, the air inside the cab thickened with smoke, steam, and unburned fuel oil. The longer the train remained in these enclosures, the more toxic the environment became. On the Roseville to Sparks line alone, the nearly continuous stretches of tunnel and shed could trap a crew in darkness and fumes for more than an hour. The worst section, east of Emigrant Gap, strung together multiple tunnels and snow sheds for nearly 10 miles without a real break. There, the only escape from the smoke was to reach the next patch of open track, if there was one. Unlike the short, well-ventilated tunnels found on most eastern railroads, the Sierra's geography offered no relief. The combination of steep grades, high elevation, and almost 40 miles of covered track created a problem no other railroad faced on this scale. The mountains themselves dictated the rules. Every design, every operating practice, every risk was shaped by the unforgiving terrain. This was not simply a matter of engineering inconvenience. The geography of the Sierra Nevada forced Southern Pacific to confront a hazard that could not be solved by tradition. In this environment, the standard locomotive design, cab at the rear, and smokestack in front, became more than a flaw. It became a deadly liability. Smoke didn't just sting the eyes or leave a bitter taste at the back of the throat. It brought men to the edge of consciousness, sometimes beyond. Veteran engineers told stories of crawling across the cab floor, desperate for the thin layer of air that might be cleaner near the floorboards. Firemen pressed wet rags to their mouths, trying to filter out the worst of the fumes. But the smoke always found its way in. In the longest tunnels and sheds, a man could feel his chest tighten, his vision blur, his hands slip from the throttle. There were nights when the only thing keeping a crew conscious was the hope of daylight just beyond the next curve. Railroad records from the early 1900s mention crews being overcome by smoke in the Sierra tunnels. Some incidents ended with a fireman or engineer collapsing at the controls, pulled out by brakemen when the train finally emerged. Others were found slumped in the cab, breathing shallowly, faces gray. Not every man made it to the next station. Death certificates from mountain counties list causes like asphyxia due to smoke inhalation or heart failure following exposure to gases in tunnel. The language is clinical. But behind each entry was a family waiting at home, a wife who had watched her husband leave for another run over the hill and never return. Union records from the Brotherhood of Locomotive Engineers and Firemen began to fill with complaints about the Sierra crossings. Letters described unbearable working conditions, men refusing to take certain assignments, or demanding extra pay for the risk. Some firemen turned down promotions if it meant regular mountain service. New hires sometimes quit after a single winter on the route. The union lobbied for better ventilation, for changes in operating practices, for anything that might keep crews alive. Southern Pacific managers received reports of men with chronic coughs, lungs damaged beyond repair after years in the tunnels. Families spoke of fathers who never breathed right again. Widows remembered husbands who left strong and came home broken, or not at all. The danger was not abstract. It was measured in funerals, in empty chairs at the dinner table, in the names entered quietly into company registers and union rolls. The Sierra Nevada did not care about tradition or pride. It demanded a solution. And it demanded it in the language of human cost. For Southern Pacific, the risk was no longer theoretical. It was written in the lives lost and the voices of those left behind. Bunker oil changed everything. For decades, the limits of steam locomotive design were set by coal, shoveled by hand, burned in fireboxes pressed up against the tender, and impossible to move far from the crew's reach. But as California's oil fields boomed in the late 19th century, a few inventive railroaders saw a new possibility. Oil was not just a cleaner fuel. It flowed. It could be piped, pumped, and pressurized. Suddenly, the firebox no longer had to sit next to the tender. William Bill Thomas, master mechanic for the North Pacific Coast Railroad, saw the opportunity first. In 1898, he rebuilt an 1875 steam engine, number 21, into something no one else had dared: a cab-forward, oil-burning locomotive. Thomas's design put the engineer and fireman at the very front, ahead of the boiler, with the firebox at the rear. The tender, loaded with heavy bunker oil, sat behind. Instead of shoveling coal, the fireman adjusted a valve. Oil, thick as molasses, traveled through pipes from the pressurized tender, feeding the firebox even as the train climbed steep grades. The system worked because oil's viscosity allowed it to be pumped over long distances and up inclines, something coal could never manage. Thomas's cab forward earned the nickname the Freak. It looked wrong, but it handled mountain curves with surprising grace. The forward engine truck led the way into tight turns, and the crew, perched at the very front, enjoyed a view no other locomotive could match. Most important, the cab sat in clear air, untouched by the exhaust that billowed behind. While Thomas's experiment ran quietly on a narrow gauge line north of San Francisco, its real significance was mechanical. By proving that oil could be delivered reliably to a firebox at the rear, he unlocked a design that coal-fired engines simply could not match. Southern Pacific engineers took notice. The company's own mountain divisions had begun converting to oil, drawn by the steady supply and reduced smoke. But the true breakthrough came with the realization that oil's flow could be controlled with just 5 pounds of pressure in the tender. This small innovation allowed heavy, viscous fuel to move through pipes even as the train strained up the 2.2% grades of the Sierra. The firemen, now separated from the tender by the length of the boiler, could still manage the fire with precision. No shoveling, no crawling through a moving train. With oil as fuel, the physical layout of the locomotive became a blank slate. The firebox could be placed at the very rear, the cab at the very front, and the boiler in between. Controls were rerouted, sightlines reimagined. The cab-forward design was no longer a fantasy. It was a practical, buildable machine. Thomas's Freak had shown what was possible. Southern Pacific's engineers were ready to take the next step. The stage was set for a full-scale trial in the most unforgiving territory on the continent. Southern Pacific's gamble took physical form in the spring of 1909. The company's mechanical department, working with Baldwin Locomotive Works, selected one of their heaviest articulated mallet freight engines for a radical rebuild. The boiler, once the heart of a conventional 2882, was now turned around. The cab, normally tucked behind the firebox and battered by exhaust, was placed at the very front. Oil pipes ran the length of the frame, feeding bunker oil under pressure from the tender at the rear. The firebox, now trailing, burned as fiercely as ever, but for the first time the crew stood shielded from its smoke. The prototype had weight and purpose. The test runs began on the Roseville to Sparks main line, the same stretch where crews had struggled for breath in the darkness of the Sierra enclosures. The prototype was sent up the eastbound climb, dragging a loaded freight through the tunnels and snow sheds that had claimed so many lungs and left so many men gasping. Observers from both the railroad and Baldwin watched from trackside and caboose, expecting trouble, mechanical breakdowns, poor handling, or at best a crew that would refuse to ride such an unorthodox machine. The test was public and tense. Inside the cab, the air was different. The engineer and fireman, riding ahead of the boiler, found themselves surrounded by the cold, clean wind of the mountain. The exhaust, once a constant threat, streamed harmlessly behind them, lost in the length of the train. The cab remained clear, even as the train crawled through miles of darkness. The controls, rerouted and reversed, responded as they should. Visibility, long a point of worry, proved better than anyone had dared hope. The crew could see both rails, the tunnel walls, and every curve ahead. Clean air made the difference. Reports from the test trips filtered back to headquarters. The verdict was immediate and unambiguous. The suffocation problem was gone. Train handling was solid on the steepest grades. The experiment had not only worked, it had outperformed the stopgap of running engines in reverse. Crews who had dreaded the climb through the sheds now asked for the cab-forward engine by name. The prototype returned to the shops with its paintwork streaked and its machinery battered by the mountain. But the men who ran it stepped down with clear eyes and steady hands. No one had collapsed. No one had been forced to crawl for air. The result was plain. Southern Pacific wasted no time. Before the year was out, the company placed an order with Baldwin for 15 more cab-forward engines, each built to the new specifications. The prototype's success in the tunnels, impossible to ignore, overrode every voice of doubt from the wider railroad community. Over the next 3.5 decades, the order book grew. From 1910 to 1944, Southern Pacific would take delivery of 256 cab-forward locomotives, the largest and most distinctive fleet of its kind in American history. These engines became the backbone of mountain railroading across the Sierra and beyond. The order led to scale. Baldwin Locomotive Works, once cautious, became a full partner in the program. Designs evolved, wheel arrangements shifted, and engineering refinements multiplied. But the core idea remained untouched. The cab belonged at the front, where the air was cleanest. Each new locomotive rolled out of the factory with its cab facing forward, a direct rebuke to a century of tradition. The engineering joke had become a proven solution, scaled up from a single prototype to a fleet that would define Southern Pacific for a generation. The legacy was vindication. Railroads across North America watched Southern Pacific's cab-forward experiment with a mix of curiosity and skepticism, but no one else followed suit. At first glance, this seems like stubbornness or short-sightedness, yet the reasons ran deeper than tradition. For most major railroads, the economic and geographic realities simply did not justify such a radical departure from standard practice. The Sierra Nevada's endless tunnels and snow sheds created a problem that was unique to Southern Pacific. Nowhere else in the country did crews spend such long stretches sealed in with their own exhaust. On the eastern seaboard, tunnels were shorter and more widely spaced. In the Midwest and the South, open air and rolling plains meant smoke dispersed quickly, and the risk of suffocation was practically non-existent. Even on other mountain routes, the combination of steep grades, high altitudes, and continuous enclosures was rare. Union Pacific, Santa Fe, and Western Pacific all had tough climbs, but their tunnels were fewer, better ventilated, or separated by long gaps of open track. The specific nightmare of 40 miles of snow shed and tunnel, sometimes with multiple locomotives working in tandem, was something only Southern Pacific had to face. The economics were equally persuasive. Converting to oil firing, redesigning locomotives, and retraining crews required major investment. For a railroad without Southern Pacific's unique geography, the costs far outweighed the benefits. Many lines still relied on coal, which could not be piped to a rear firebox. Others were already exploring electrification for their longest tunnels, or simply accepted the occasional discomfort as part of mountain railroading. In the end, the decision not to adopt the cab forward was not a failure of imagination. It was a clear-eyed calculation. Southern Pacific's solution was perfect for the Sierra Nevada, but it would have been an expensive, unnecessary fix almost anywhere else. The cab forward stands as a reminder that sometimes the right answer is the one that fits only your own set of problems. By the early 1950s, the sound of steam echoing through the Sierra tunnels began to fade. Southern Pacific's mountain lines, once ruled by the cab forward, now saw a new kind of locomotive at the head of heavy freights, diesel electrics. These engines burned no coal, produced no choking smoke, and needed no radical rearrangement to keep their crews safe. Where steam had demanded constant attention and left the air thick with exhaust, the diesels glided through the same tunnels almost silently, their exhaust nearly invisible and far less hazardous. The transformation came quickly. Between 1947 and the mid-1950s, Southern Pacific replaced its entire fleet of steam locomotives with diesel power. The last cab forwards hauled revenue trains over Donner Pass in late 1956. There was no drama, no disaster, just the quiet, inevitable end of an era. The problem that had demanded such an extreme solution simply vanished, erased by a new technology that made suffocation in tunnels a thing of the past. Most of the 256 cab forwards were scrapped, their steel recycled, and their stories nearly lost. But one engine, AC-12 number 4294, was spared. Built in 1944, it survived the cutting torch and now stands on display at the California State Railroad Museum in Sacramento. Its presence is a silent witness to a time when the solution to a deadly problem meant turning everything around, and when the passage of progress made even the boldest innovations obsolete. Innovation often looks wrong, until the stakes demand we rethink every rule. Southern Pacific's cab forward didn't just save lives. It proved that the best solution isn't always the one everyone else accepts. Today, as industries face new crises, the courage to question convention remains as vital as ever. Sometimes progress means running headlong into the unknown. What would you challenge if lives depended on it?